No one tells you that a Queen of England was once dug out of the earth. Not once. Not twice. But over and over again by the curious, the drunk, and even the so-called devout. No one warns you that the one wife who survived Henry VIII ended up with a fate more disturbing than the two who were beheaded. She was Katherine Parr, the woman history politely labeled as the lucky last wife. The one who didn't get burned, didn't get executed, didn't get cast aside. She outlived the monstrous king in his final grotesque years when his body stank and split and festered, and his mind grew darker than ever. But death did not bring her peace. Because what happened to Katherine Parr after she died was something no queen, no woman deserved. In the year 1548, on the 30th of August, Katherine Parr gave birth to her first and only child at Sudeley Castle. 5 days later, on the 5th of September, she was dead, officially. She died from complications of childbirth. A few dry words in most history books. What they don't tell you is that hers was the first fully Protestant funeral in English history. She was embalmed in cloth, wrapped in lead, and laid to rest in the small chapel of St. Mary at Sudeley, her body undisturbed in peaceful dignity. But not for long. That rest would last barely 1 century. Then came fire. Then came ruin. And then came the first hands to pull her back from the grave. In the year 1642, the English Civil War tore through the country. Troops of Parliament's army stormed the castle and smashed its chapel. They broke down the roof, ripped apart tombs, desecrated graves. Katherine Parr's resting place was among them. Her coffin was torn open. Her bones were exposed. Her remains, the body of a former queen, were defiled. There is no detailed record of what was done to her then. Perhaps she was tossed aside. Perhaps she was stomped into the earth. Or perhaps they simply laughed and moved on. But from that moment forward, Katherine Parr would no longer rest in peace. Her corpse had become a curiosity, a relic, and soon, a plaything. 240 years after her death, in the summer of the year 1782, a group of curious noblewomen arrived at the ruins of Sudeley. They had heard rumors of a queen buried somewhere beneath the rubble. They found a block of alabaster against the northern wall of the ruined chapel. They called in some local men to dig, less than a meter beneath the stone. They struck lead. A coffin. On it, an inscription: Catherine, Queen Dowager, wife of Henry VIII. Without hesitation, they pried it open, 2 centuries dead. Yet Katherine Parr's face was still there, intact. Her body had not decayed. Her skin, they said, was pale, but whole. Her hair still gold. Her limbs still formed. Her eyes still present. The ladies were horrified, yet unable to look away. They peeled back the cloth, examined her hands, and cut a few locks of her hair. Then they asked the men to seal the coffin again and bury her. But the tale didn't end there. A few weeks later, a local farmer named Lucas caught wind of the story. He wanted to see the queen for himself. He returned to the site, dug her up again, opened the coffin. And this time he didn't just look, he sliced through the burial wrappings, touched the flesh on her arm, and remarked that it was white and moist. Then, of course, he took more of her hair, a few bits of the burial linen, and went home, satisfied. In the years that followed, it became something of a habit. The steward of the estate reopened the coffin the very next year. Then a priest opened it again 4 years later. Then again, and again. Each time they opened it, the body grew less whole. The head decayed, The teeth fell out. The arms turned brown. The hands shriveled. But curiosity didn't stop. If anything, it escalated. One night, 6 years after the priest's visit, a group of drunken men broke into the chapel. They dragged Katherine Parr's corpse out of the coffin, laughed as they danced with it, and desecrated it in a way no words can quite capture. One man, it was said, took an iron bar and rammed it through her torso. Then they dumped her body in a corner head downward and left. She stayed that way for decades. Abandoned, twisted, buried upside down. Until finally, in the year 1817, a reverend decided to restore her dignity. The chapel was rebuilt. The coffin was found still upside down. The body now reduced to bones and bits of cloth and hair. But this time, she was placed into a new tomb, given a new coffin, and a carved effigy of Queen Catherine was laid upon it, hands clasped in eternal prayer, as if nothing had ever happened. But it had happened, and you just heard it. This is not folklore. This is not a fable. This is a Queen of England, whose corpse was mocked, cut, danced with, and stabbed by men history forgot to mention. They called her the survivor. But she did not survive what came after death. And this is only the beginning. She had outlived the most dangerous man in England, the man whose wives did not often survive their place in his bed, nor the weight of his crown. She had walked through fire without being burned, through court without being broken, and had, by many measures, escaped. They called her the lucky one. But luck is a word spoken too quickly in the company of grief. And Katherine Parr would find that life, even after kings, could be just as cruel, just as sharp, and just as final. She had survived Henry VIII. Yes, but she would not survive childbirth. It was in the summer of the year 1548 that Katherine Parr began to feel the quickening of a child she never thought she would bear. She had never been pregnant before. 3 husbands had come and gone, one by death, one by annulment, and one by monarchy, and in all those years, no child had grown within her. But now, at the age when most women had given up any dream of motherhood, her belly began to swell. The man responsible was Thomas Seymour, brother of the former Queen, Jane Seymour, and uncle to the new boy king, Edward VI. He was ambitious, charming, reckless, and dangerous in ways that did not announce themselves until it was too late. He had waited for Henry's death like a hound outside a butcher's door. And when the king's final breath left his bloated body, Thomas came sniffing for power. He found it not through Parliament, nor council, but through Catherine. He wanted her name, her dowry, her access to the new royal household. And Catherine, perhaps starved for affection after years with the tyrant king, said yes. Their marriage was quiet, secret, forbidden by many, and ultimately scandalous. But Catherine did not care. After a lifetime of playing queen and nurse and mother to monarchs not her own, she had chosen to love. And from that love came life, a little girl whose name would barely be spoken before it was lost to time. For Catherine, that summer at Sudeley Castle was meant to be her season of peace, the gentle twilight of a hard-fought life. She was surrounded by gardens, books, and the quiet sound of young Lady Jane Grey's footsteps as she studied her Latin lessons under Catherine's careful eye. But something darker stirred beneath the surface, not in the halls of the castle, but within her body itself. Childbirth in Tudor England was a ceremony of silence and fear. It was called the woman's death. For good reason. Even the healthiest young women could bleed out in hours, or slip into fevers that melted their minds. And Katherine was not young. She was nearing 40. An age at which the body grows tired of surprises, and the womb no longer responds with grace. Yet she prepared her chambers, selected her midwives, and placed her life in the hands of chance. On the 30th of August, the labor came. Long, slow, agonizing. The sounds of it did not echo down the stone corridors of Sudeley as one might think. They were muffled by linen hangings, by heavy wooden doors, by the discretion of women who knew how close the veil between life and death could become. Katherine gave birth to a daughter, a healthy baby girl, a miracle, by any measure. She held her child briefly. Perhaps she named her. Perhaps she whispered something no one else heard. But only 5 days later, on the 5th of September, Katherine Parr died. The records say she succumbed to childbed fever, a phrase used in the Tudor age to describe the slow, septic poisoning of the body after childbirth, when bacteria entered torn flesh and turned it into rot. Today we know it as puerperal fever, a preventable infection in the world of modern medicine. But in Katherine's time it was death, with a polite name. Her body swelled, her mind clouded. She slipped into delirium. And by the time the castle bells tolled, it was not for celebration. Thomas Seymour was not a man known for grief. Barely waiting for her body to grow cold, he fled the castle. Some say he was too overcome with sorrow to remain. Others say he left to plot his next political move, already forgetting the woman who had just died, bringing his child into the world. Either way, he was not present when Katherine's coffin was prepared, and here, strangely, begins the part of Katherine Parr's story that history remembers not the quiet ache of her death, nor the cries of her newborn daughter, but the box into which she was placed. It was a simple lead coffin, lined with cloth, sealed tightly to protect against the corruption of flesh. But it would not protect her for long. Her funeral was the first of its kind. For the first time in England's long Catholic history, a queen was laid to rest with a fully Protestant rite. No Latin masses. No prayers to saints. No relics or incense. Instead, psalms in English. A sermon. A hope in resurrection not tied to Rome but to Reformation. The chief mourner was young Jane Grey, the girl who would one day be queen for 9 days before losing her head. Jane stood at the side of the bier, pale and composed, perhaps already understanding that royalty offered no safety, and that crowns sat uneasily on the heads of women. Katherine's coffin was carried into the chapel at Sudeley, and placed beneath a freshly cut slab of stone. On top would later sit a tomb of alabaster, carved with her likeness, hands folded in prayer, eyes cast to heaven, robes flowing in a way that suggested peace. Beneath that sculpture, however, was something more fragile, more human, and far more vulnerable than anyone could have imagined. What? No one knew at that moment. No priest. No mourner. Not even the infant girl left behind was that Katherine Parr's body would not rest quietly beneath that stone. Her story was not over. The grave had not finished with her. The earth, it seemed, would not hold her, and the centuries ahead would treat her not as a queen, not even as a woman, but as a relic, an object, a body to be examined, prodded, handled, and hurt. But that was still to come. For now, the stone was sealed, the chapel was silent, and Katherine Parr, queen, Schular, and stepmother, survivor, lay alone in the dark, unaware of the hands that would one day disturb her sleep. When a queen dies, the court is meant to mourn. There are rituals for it, black cloth hung from windowsills, candles kept burning through the night, prayers whispered in Latin or English, depending on the reigning monarch's mood. But when Katherine Parr passed away in the autumn of the year 1548, the mourning was brief, almost mechanical, like a box that had been ticked. The bells of Sudeley rang, the Protestant psalms were sung, and Jane Grey stood still at the head of the coffin. But the man who should have wept, the man whose child Catherine had just died delivering, was already gone. Thomas Seymour had left the castle, left the child, and left the chapel. He left before the grave was even cold. Perhaps there were tears, but not the kind that fall from the eye. Thomas Seymour did not linger in sorrow, and he did not bury himself in memory. He returned to court, sleeve pressed, ambitions sharper than ever, his heart not worn on his sleeve, but sealed somewhere deep behind a wall of self-interest and strategy. He was no stranger to death. His own sister-in-law Jane Seymour had died giving birth to the boy who now sat as king, and perhaps that was the way of Tudor men to grieve, with their mouths closed and their minds fixed firmly on power. His marriage to Catherine had always been controversial. It was not the match that court expected. It was not even a match they allowed. Catherine had been queen, the widow of Henry VIII, and any man who touched her after the king's death did so at great personal risk. Royal widows were not meant to love again, let alone remarry so soon. But Thomas had not waited. He had begun to court Catherine in the final years of Henry's life, whispering promises behind the curtain of royal decorum, waiting like a predator just beyond the torchlight. As soon as the king died in January of the year 1547, Thomas pressed forward. He knew he could not ask the new boy king, Edward VI, for permission to marry the former queen, nor could he seek approval from the Regency Council who ruled in the boy's stead. So he didn't. He and Catherine married in secret. There were whispers, a stolen wedding, a scandalous haste, rumors that Catherine had not even finished mourning her dead husband before she had taken a new one. But there had been affection between them, or at least something that looked like affection in the dim light of royal loneliness. Catherine had known Thomas long before she became queen, back when she was still navigating her place in noble society. And he had once courted her before. It is possible, some even say, likely, that she had loved him. Loved the charm he wore like a velvet cloak, loved the way he made her feel like something more than a pawn on a chessboard of old men and crumbling kings. But Thomas Seymour was not the kind of man who loved quietly. He was not built for domestic happiness or gentle fatherhood. He was built for court, for ambition, for politics dressed in silk. And after Catherine died, he did not sit in Sudeley Castle reflecting on their marriage. He did not sit beside the cradle of the child they had made. He moved, instead, towards something greater, or so he believed. That child, their daughter, whose name was Mary, would not survive long. She disappeared from the records not long after Catherine's death, a soft fading like breath against a window pane. No monument marks her resting place. No portrait shows her face. She was born into a castle and lost to history almost immediately. And Thomas, her father, and never spoke of her again. Instead, his eyes turned toward another royal girl, not a woman this time, but a child. A girl of 13 years named Elizabeth, daughter of Anne Boleyn and the late King Henry, living under the care of Catherine before her death. When Thomas returned to Elizabeth's household, He brought with him a recklessness that would darken every corner of her early life. He would visit her chambers early in the morning, tickle her, slap her playfully, pull at her bedsheets. At first, it was called teasing. Then, it became alarming. Elizabeth's governess grew uneasy. Catherine, before her death, had already begun to intervene. But after the Queen was gone, no one stood between Elizabeth and Seymour's ambitions. He wanted influence. He wanted to marry her. Perhaps he even believed he could one day become king himself, not by blood, but by marriage and manipulation. The Tudor court was fragile in those years. Edward VI was a child. The council was divided. Elizabeth was rising, and Thomas believed he could position himself at the center of it all. But he moved too quickly, too openly. He angered the Lord, Protector, his own brother. Edward Seymour and the entire house of cards began to wobble. By the beginning of the year, 1549, rumors were no longer whispers. They were spoken aloud in halls and carried on paper between spies. Thomas Seymour was arrested in January. He was charged with 33 counts of treason, among them, plotting to marry Elizabeth without permission, planning to abduct the king, keeping arms, gathering men, and more. Katherine Parr's name was not among the charges. She was already dust. On the 20th of March in that same year, Thomas Seymour was executed on Tower Hill. He died, they said, with dignity, calm, composed, unrepentant. His neck met the blade swiftly, and just like that, the man who once danced in the Queen's bedroom, who touched her belly, swollen with child, who watched her die, and did not stay to bury her, was gone. It is difficult to mourn a man like Thomas Seymour. History remembers him as many things: dashing, dangerous, disloyal, a man who never stood still long enough to hold grief, a man who chased crowns and left corpses behind him. But for a brief moment, he had been Catherine's husband. For a short summer, they had shared laughter in the gardens of Sudeley. For 5 days, he had been the father of her child. Perhaps, somewhere in the deep silence of the tomb, she forgave him. Or perhaps, as the centuries passed and her coffin was disturbed over and over again by strangers and vandals and the curious pastate, she remembered that he had been the first to leave her behind. In the quiet shadows of Sudeley Castle, 2 girls had once walked beside a queen. One of them was too small to remember. The other would carry the weight of memory for the rest of her short, tragic life. When Katherine Parr died in the early autumn of the year 1548, her newborn daughter was just 5 days old, and her young ward, Lady Jane Grey, was still only 10 years of age. One had just arrived in the world. The other had barely stepped into it. And the woman who had held both of them in her arms was already gone, lost to the silence that came after fever, after labor, after loyalty and learning and love had been extinguished like the last candle in a chapel window. The baby girl Mary Seymour was left behind, swaddled in fine cloth, too young to cry for what she had lost. Her mother had been queen. Her father, a nobleman condemned. Her name, a whisper in court, a detail in a will, a burden for guardians who did not want to raise, a child whose future was too closely tangled with disgrace. After Catherine died, and Thomas Seymour was executed, there was no one left to speak for her. The castle was emptied of mourning, and Mary was placed into the care of strangers. There are records that suggest she was raised by the Duchess of Suffolk for a time. A line in a letter here, a note in an estate account there, but then nothing. By the time she should have reached her 2nd birthday, her name had vanished. No tombstone. No burial record. No marriage. No death. She faded into the silence like a drop of rain into the earth. No one knows when she died. Only that she must have, because history never speaks of her again. But the other girl remained. Lady Jane Grey had been a quiet shadow in Catherine's life. A child placed under her guardianship, not just for protection but for education. Catherine believed in learning, had always believed that the mind was not the enemy of a woman's virtue, but its ally. She had brought books into the Queen's chambers, had argued for the right to read scripture in English, had written prayers in her own hand, and sent them out into the world under her name. And into this world of letters and language, she had brought Jane Grey, teaching her Latin, Greek, and theology, with the same care she once gave to Elizabeth, the future queen whose intelligence Catherine had also helped shape. Jane was bright. Jane was obedient. Jane was small and serious. A girl with eyes too wide for her thin face, and a voice that was seldom raised above a whisper. She was there when Catherine gave birth. She was there when the fever began. She was there when the coffin was sealed. And she was there at the funeral. Standing not as a child, but as the chief mourner, dressed in the dark garments of grief, holding herself still among women, twice her age. She did not cry. She did not falter. Even at 10. Jane understood that death was the price women often paid for being close to power. And though she had not yet been crowned, Jane Grey was already walking the path of queenship. Barefoot and blindfolded, after Catherine's death, Jane remained a ward of the crown. Her guardianship passed from one hand to another, no longer under the warmth of a woman who saw her as a mind to be nourished, but under the cold logic of men who saw her as a claim to be married off. She was a cousin of the king, a Protestant, educated, obedient. She ticked all the boxes of political usefulness, and so, while Mary Seymour was erased from the pages, Jane Grey was written into history pencil at first, then ink, then blood. In the final years of Edward VI's short life, when his lungs grew weak and his hands grew cold, it was Jane who was chosen to follow him, not his sister Mary, whose Catholic faith terrified the court, not Elizabeth, whose mother's fall still cast long shadows, but Jane, gentle Jane, whose mind was filled with Greek verbs and Protestant verses, whose backbone no one had ever tested because no one thought it needed testing. When the crown was offered to her, she wept. When it was placed upon her, she begged for it to be taken back. She had not wanted to be queen, but she had learned, in the chambers of Katherine Parr, how to obey. And so she obeyed. 9 days later, she was imprisoned. 6 months after that, she was beheaded. She died young. She died still a girl, barely 17. Her neck laid upon the block by a man too weary to tremble. She had not ruled. She had barely spoken. But her name would echo forever. The 9 Days Queen. Her bones lie beneath the Tower of London now, not far from the spot where Anne Boleyn once bled, where Catherine Howard once screamed, and where the ghosts of royal girls whisper to one another through walls, no longer listening. But before all of that, before the crown and the scaffold and the sudden end, there was a summer at Sudeley. There was a queen who read her Latin prayers aloud in the garden. There were lessons in the quiet morning light. There were soft hands turning pages. There was Catherine, smiling with ink on her fingers, showing Jane the shape of letters, the strength of words, the safety that could be found in thought. And maybe, in her final moments, Jane remembered that maybe she closed her eyes not to the sound of axe on wood, but to the imagined voice of a woman who had once called her clever girl and meant it not as flattery, but but as truth. Maybe her last breath was not fear but memory. Because while Mary Seymour vanished without a trace, Jane Grey left behind something else entirely, not power, not victory, not even a legacy, but a question. What does it mean to be chosen, to be raised up for others' gain, to be told you are worthy only when it suits them, and discarded the moment you no longer fit the mold? Katherine Parr had asked those questions in her writing. Jane Grey had lived the answers in her death. And together, in a way, no monument could capture. They had both become more than queens. They had become caution. It had been more than 200 years since she died. And still they came. Not to weep. Not to remember. Not even to pay respect. But to look. To dig. To open what had been closed. To take what had never been offered. The dead should sleep. That is the one mercy time is meant to give us. But time was not kind to Katherine Parr. It let her body lie undisturbed for barely 1 century before the first hands came, tearing away stone and earth, peeling back silence as if it were a veil meant to be lifted by the curious, by the bold, by the ignorant. The year was 1782. The chapel at Sudeley Castle, once a sacred space sealed in grief, had become little more than a ruin, a skeleton of its former self, its roof long collapsed, its floor cracked by ivy and root, its altar bare, yet still it held her, beneath stone and ash and soil. The leaden coffin of a queen rested where it had been placed more than 2 centuries before. No one had meant to find it. No one had planned to disturb her. But history has a way of luring those who are too enchanted by the past to leave it buried. They were ladies of a certain class. Curious. Well-read. Dressed in summer gowns and wide hats. Passing through the countryside on an afternoon visit. They had heard the legends that a queen lay buried beneath the chapel. Ruins. They followed whispers like children follow a ghost story. And when they found a slab of alabaster along the northern wall, they felt certain they had found the place. They called for help. A few local men arrived. Shovels in hand. Boots heavy with mud. No one asked if it was right. No one considered the dignity of the dead. They simply dug, less than 2 feet below the stone. They struck lead. A coffin. Whole. Intact. Marked. The inscription confirmed what they had already dared to believe. Katherine Parr, Queen Dowager of England, wife to Henry VIII, lay beneath them. No one hesitated. The top of the coffin was pried open. The air hissed with centuries of silence being broken. And there she was, wrapped tightly in cerecloth. Her body was preserved in a way that defied logic. Her face, they said, still held its shape. Her eyes, though dulled, had not sunken into nothingness. Her limbs had not withered to bone. Her hair golden still clung to her scalp. The women gasped. One reached forward and, with gentle fingers, cut away a lock of that royal hair. A keepsake. Another peeled back the cloth to see her hand, still white, still formed, moist. Even. They did not scream. They did not flee. They marveled. As if she were a specimen. As if her body had been left behind not for rest, but for wonder. When they were done, they asked the men to close the coffin and rebury her. They thought, perhaps, that would be the end of it, that the ground would seal itself again. But once the earth has been stirred, it does not forget the scent of what lies beneath. And others would follow only days later. A local farmer, Mr. Lucas, heard the story. He had not seen the queen with his own eyes, and he could not let the opportunity pass. He returned to the site. dug into the soft earth, opened the coffin again. What he found did not horrify him. It intrigued him. He took a knife and cut through the cerecloth, wrapping her arm. The flesh, he said, was still white, still soft, still warm to the touch. He did not stop there. He cut away more of the cloth, examined the fingers. He took more of her hair, a piece of the cloth itself, a scrap of the gown she had been buried in. Then he left. The coffin was closed again, but not with reverence, with haste, as if she were no longer a person, but something less. The following year, the steward of the estate ordered the grave reopened yet again, this time for official inspection. The coffin was exposed for the third time in 12 months. The body had begun to change. Decay had finally started its slow, cruel work. Her hands were turning brown. Her head was no longer whole. Teeth had fallen loose from her mouth. And still, men stood over her with curiosity rather than grief, as if she were not the last wife of a king but a puzzle made of flesh and time. A clergyman made a sketch of her decaying form, noting the size of her feet, the proportions of her arms, the length of her limbs. He recorded these details with the detached interest of a man cataloging furniture, not a body. 4 years later, her coffin was opened again, this time by another clergyman, who made yet another study. And 6 years after that, in the year 1790, came the darkest exhumation of all. A group of drunken vandals, emboldened by wine and bravado, forced their way into the chapel under moonlight. They smashed the coffin open. They pulled Katherine Parr's body out of it, dragged it across the floor, and danced around it. They lifted her arms. They twisted her torso. And then when their drunken delight began to fade, they stabbed an iron bar straight through her chest. They dumped the corpse in a heap, upside down, in a pile of dirt and broken wood. And then they left. No one knows what became of those men. No punishment was recorded. No name was remembered. Only Katherine remained damaged, now beyond recognition, desecrated beyond repair. A queen made into an object and then into debris. Her body was later discovered, years later, still upside down, still pierced, still wrapped in scraps of what once had been the gown of a Tudor queen. The night diggers did not come with lanterns or prayers. They did not carry offerings. They brought only the worst of human curiosity, the kind that does not tremble in front of the sacred, the kind that does not recognize rest, the kind that believes the dead belong to the living, and not the other way around. And so she waited again, no longer whole, no longer honored, no longer sealed, only silent. There are many kinds of theft. Some are loud and sudden, like the breaking of a window in the night. Others are quiet, almost polite, carried out not with violence, but with curiosity, wrapped in lace gloves and cloaked in the false language of interest. The theft of Katherine Parr did not happen all at once. It happened slowly, over years, over decades, over centuries. And it began with something small, a single lock of hair, when her coffin was first opened in the year 1782. No one reached for treasure. There were no jewels left to take, no rings on her fingers, no gold buried with the queen. But there was her hair thick, pale gold, somehow still clinging to her scalp after more than 200 years in the earth. The women who stood over her that summer afternoon marveled at it. It was beautiful, in its way, fragile, unexpected. One of them, emboldened by the hush of the moment, reached forward and snipped a lock free. It was not greed. It was not even disrespect. It was something harder to name, part sentiment. I'm part superstition. Part need to carry proof that they had seen something rare. Something half alive. She folded the hair into her handkerchief. She would keep it, she said, as a token, a memento of a queen. Others followed. A farmer cut more from the back of her head, wrapping it in paper and storing it somewhere beneath the floorboards of his cottage. The estate steward took samples of the linen in which she had been wrapped, praising the fine weave of the fabric, marveling that it had survived so long underground. Another visitor, a clergyman, took a fragment of her gown, the same gown in which she had been buried. Its color long faded, its stitching now barely holding. None of them called it stealing. They called it preserving, studying, honoring. But they did not ask permission. They did not kneel. They did not imagine the Queen's ghost watching from the corner of the chapel, her eyes dim but furious. It is easy to think of royal remains as untouchable, as sacred, as protected by the same walls that once kept their living bodies safe. But Katherine Parr was not protected. Her tomb, unlike those in Westminster or Windsor, was not guarded. There were no gilded gates around her resting place, no thick marble lids or carved effigies, warning intruders to keep their distance. She had been buried in a chapel that fell to ruin. And when the roof gave way and the stones cracked and the windows shattered, so too did the seal of her grave. Once the first souvenir had been taken, others followed like moths to a flame. It became an open secret. The Queen, at Sudeley, her body still there, her coffin still reachable, and so the curious came not in great crowds, but in pairs, in threes, in secret. Some came with sketchbooks and candles, others with knives and jars. A doctor took a strip of skin from her arm and placed it in spirits to observe how it would react. A clergyman peeled back the cloth from her left hand and drew a careful rendering of her fingers, describing them as delicate, noble, still pale in death. He took nothing but the image, or so he claimed. Others were less restrained. Someone took a tooth. Not many. Perhaps just one or two. Plucked from the jaw with a gloved hand, held to the light like pearls. A man removed the shoes from her feet, small and narrow, Tudor style, crumbling at the edges. He kept them for a time, then sold them to a collector, who would eventually lose them in a fire. Another stole a piece of her burial pillow. Another chipped off part of the lead coffin itself, believing it would bring him luck. These souvenirs were not stolen with malice, but they were stolen all the same. Each one removed something of her. Each one reduced her. Each hand that reached into the coffin took more than fabric or flesh. They took her silence, her dignity, her rest. And piece by piece, the woman who had once ruled beside a king was turned into fragments, curiosities locked in drawers, tucked between books, forgotten in attics. Some of those pieces may still exist. A curl of hair in a glass frame, a strip of cloth folded in a diary, a sliver of leather shoe mislabeled in a museum drawer. No one tracks such things. No one catalogs the thefts that happen slowly, over centuries, in the name of history. But they happened, again and again, and with every visit, every intrusion. The woman in the coffin became less a queen and more an object, something to be discussed, displayed, dissected. There were voices who tried to stop it. A few local priests spoke out, calling for the grave to be sealed permanently. A vicar wrote to the bishop, begging that Katherine be reburied in stone, locked away from the hands of the curious. But nothing was done. The chapel remained open, The coffin remained reachable, and the souvenirs continued to vanish into pockets and drawers and quiet, respectable homes. It is difficult to know whether Katherine Parr would have raged at this, or simply sighed. She had lived her life in a court of secrets, and survived a marriage of danger, watched as others better loved, better protected had fallen. Perhaps she had always known that peace, for women like her, was only ever temporary, that even in death, there would be no true stillness. By the time the 19th century arrived, there was very little left of her that had not been seen, touched, or taken. Her hands, once described as pale and fine, had darkened. Her hair had thinned. Her jaw had lost its teeth. Her gown was now no more than shreds of faded cloth, stiff with time. She no longer looked like a queen. She barely looked human. But still, people came. And still, they took. The dead do not ask for reverence. They do not rise from the soil to demand candles or crowns or psalms in stone chapels. All they ask for is sleep undisturbed, uninterrupted, unseen. But Katherine Parr, who had survived the violent heart of Henry VIII and endured the blood-soaked rhythm of his court, would find no such sleep beneath the crumbling stones of Sudeley. Not in death, not even centuries after it, because there came a night, one dark with drink and laughter and the kind of mischief that turns quickly to cruelty, when men did not come to see her, or even to steal from her, but simply to mock what remained. It was a night when the Queen was made into a plaything. The year was 1790. It had been more than 2 centuries since Catherine had died. More than 2 decades since her coffin had first been opened. More than enough time, one would think, for the world to forget her grave. But the memory of a buried queen lingers like smoke. Her resting place had become a whispered challenge, a thing dared over drink, told in taverns near the castle walls, and so a group of men, none of them noble, none of them sober, crept into the ruins of St. Mary's Chapel under cover of night. They brought no lanterns of mourning, no flowers for her name. They carried instead wine and laughter, iron bars and boots made for kicking through stone. It was not curiosity that drove them, as it had the women who had once cut away her golden hair. It was not reverence, as it had been for the clergymen who tried to draw her likeness. It was something colder, more careless. It was the intoxicated thrill of knowing that beneath a shallow stone slab, the body of a queen lay, waiting, unguarded, unwatched. They broke the coffin open without ceremony. It had already been loosened by time and hands before theirs. The lead bent like old bark. The wrappings within were stiff, but still held the shape of a woman who had once sat beside a king. They pulled her out, this queen, this scholar, this stepmother of Elizabeth I, and held her up like a puppet. She did not resist. The dead cannot. They laughed. They stumbled. They danced. They spun her through the dust of her own broken chapel, made a game of her arms, tossed her limbs like discarded rope, and then one of them, perhaps the boldest or the most broken, took up a long iron bar, rusted, jagged, no more than a piece of scrap from the ruins, and drove it straight through her chest. The sound it made is not recorded. There is no account of whether the others gasped or cheered or simply went quiet. But the bar remained, piercing her torso, splitting the cloth, cracking the bones that had once carried the weight of royal robes. She had survived Henry. She had survived childbirth. She had survived centuries. But now she was skewered like carrion beneath the moonlight. A queen made into spectacle, left in a heap when the thrill wore off. They did not bury her again. Not properly. They pushed her back into the broken coffin, what was left of it upside down, with the bar still lodged inside her. Then they disappeared, shadows slipping out of the chapel like nothing had happened, like it was just another night of drink and dare and forgetting. No one stopped them. No one punished them. Their names were not recorded. Their families not shamed. Their hands not made to scrub the blood of history from the stone floor. They left no trace but the damage and damage, like ghosts. Lingers. When the chapel was inspected years later, Catherine's body was found again. The wrappings were torn. The flesh had mostly decayed. Her bones were broken. The iron bar still pierced her ribcage. She was upside down in her coffin, twisted and bent, more ruined now than any war had made her. And even then, no great monument was raised. No wall was built to protect her. She was noted. She was observed. She was placed back into the ground with only slightly more care than the Vandals had shown. And the world moved on. The men who had danced with her that night might have told the story again in some alehouse, laughing about the time they pulled a queen from her grave. Or perhaps they kept it silent, forgetting it like a bad dream, convinced that no one would remember, that no one cared. But this is the part that matters. She was not forgotten. Not truly. Not by the earth. Not by time. Not by the silence that echoes louder than any song. Because there is something in us, deep and wordless, that recoils at the idea of a woman, any woman being treated like that. And even more so when that woman once wore a crown. Katherine Parr had lived with dignity. She had served as queen, as stepmother, as scholar, as writer, as caretaker to Henry in his last stinking years, as mentor to Elizabeth and Jane Grey. She had written her own prayers, had defied accusations of heresy, had nursed the wounds of a tyrant. And for all that, she had been stripped of peace and death, denied rest, defiled not by politics or execution but by boredom, by cruelty, by drunken hands. We speak of history as if it belongs to kings, but sometimes history is in the hands of cowards. Sometimes it is carved not with swords, but with laughter. Sometimes the deepest wounds are made not on battlefields, but in the quiet desecration of the forgotten. And so she lay there, speared through the heart, turned face down, no longer a queen, no longer a mother, no longer even a woman. In the eyes of those who saw her only as something left behind. But someone would come. Someone would remember, not to make her royal again, but to make her human. By the time the priest arrived, there was very little left of her that could still be called whole. The woman who had once signed royal proclamations as Queen of England, who had written prayers in her own hand and taught Latin to future monarchs, had become bones broken, scattered, desecrated bones, lying face down in a crumbling coffin with a rusted iron bar still lodged in her chest. Her name had survived. Yes, and so had pieces of her story. But her body had become a relic of violence, a memory worn thin by the careless hands of time. And yet, there was one man, a clergyman with no crown, no title, no audience, who decided that it was time, at last, to give her back what the centuries had taken. It was the year 1817, and the chapel at Sudeley, like Catherine herself, had been nearly forgotten, overgrown with ivy, cracked by wind and rain. Its once sacred walls had long been silent, but the estate had changed hands. And with it came a new desire to restore what had been lost, not just stones and pews and stained glass, but memory. And in that mission came a minister, Reverend John Littleton, who believed that a queen, no matter how long dead, deserved peace. He did not arrive with soldiers or scribes. He did not seek treasure or spectacle. He came with a Bible in one hand and reverence in the other. And beneath the rubble of the North Chapel, he found her. The coffin, such as it was, lay split and crooked, the lid barely holding. Inside, what remained of Katherine Parr was unmistakably hers, a partial skull, one pale tuft of hair clinging to the base of the neck, a few pieces of cloth fused to bone by the damp passage of time, and a thin sliver of skin across one hand that had not yet fully surrendered to dust. The iron bar still pierced her ribs. The remains had clearly been handled, mishandled, moved, and abused. There was no ceremony, no dignity. She had been returned to the ground like refuse. But Reverend Littleton did not look away. He made arrangements not with fanfare, but with quiet determination. A new coffin was ordered, simple, solid, proper, not for glory, for rest. The broken remnants of her body were gently gathered, not pieced together like some museum reconstruction, but wrapped in linen and placed with care. The iron bar was removed. The bones were cleaned. Prayers were said. The priest did not ask history for permission. He acted as though forgiveness were still possible. And then, for the first time in over 260 years, Katherine Parr was laid to rest, not by soldiers or scholars or looters, but by the hands of someone who simply believed she should be left alone. The new coffin was placed within a stone vault, built into the floor of the restored chapel. With her name inscribed above, a carved effigy was added, a likeness of Katherine lying in eternal prayer, her hands folded gently at her breast, her robes flowing as if caught in soft wind. There was no iron through her heart, no hands in her hair, no boots on her grave, just silence, stillness, sanctuary. And there she remains. It is easy to forget that peace is not something the dead automatically receive. Sometimes it must be given. Sometimes it must be fought for, not with swords or laws, but with remembrance, with care, with the refusal to let cruelty be the final word in a life. Katherine Parr's story is not only about a queen who survived a tyrant, nor about the men who looted her coffin or danced with her corpse. It is also about a man with no title who chose to protect what was left of her. A man who stepped into the ruins and said enough. He could not change what had been done. He could not uncut the hair, unpierce the ribs, or unwrite the centuries of silence that had turned Katherine from woman to artifact. But he could lay her down in peace. He could stop the digging. He could close the lid, not as a trapdoor for curiosity, but as a door to rest. And in doing so, he ended something. Not her memory, not her place in history, but the cycle of taking. Today, if you walk through the chapel at Sudley, you will find her there still, no longer alone. For others have since been buried nearby, but her tomb is quiet, watched only by sunlight through stained glass and the soft shuffle of visitors who read the inscription, who see the carving of her folded hands, and perhaps do not know the journey her body endured to arrive there. She is not venerated like Anne Boleyn. She is not romanticized like Catherine Howard. She has no tower, no myth, no famous last words. What Katherine Parr has is this: a prayer carved in stone, a tomb placed carefully into the earth, and at last, a sleep that no one has dared to interrupt again. But her story still moves, softly, like wind through a forgotten corridor. It does not shout. It does not demand. It waits like she waited for someone to see what was done. And to say this, too, was a queen. She is remembered, if she is remembered at all, as the one who lived, the one who outlasted Henry VIII, the sixth wife, the final wife, the survivor. It is a title that sounds noble, triumphant, even like she walked out of the court with her head held high and her crown still intact while others bled in towers and were buried in haste. But survival is not always victory. And for Katherine Parr, the years that came after the king's death were not filled with peace. They were filled with quiet grief, with betrayal, with loneliness, and finally with disappearance. There are no grand speeches written in her name, no gilded portraits hanging in the great halls of English palaces that capture her wisdom or her patience or the way she bent. Over and over again, without breaking, her story is scattered, found in letters, in old prayers, in fragments of cloth and broken stones. And perhaps that is fitting, because she herself was scattered, first by the politics of a violent court, then by the men who used her love for their own ends, and finally by the centuries that would not let her rest. Even in death, she had done everything asked of her. She had married where she was told to marry. She had kept her head down when others lifted theirs and lost them. She had endured the stinking rot of a dying king's wounds, tended to a palace filled with ghosts, and read her Bible aloud in a world that punished women for thinking too much. She had written her faith onto paper when most women were still being taught to write only their names. She had nursed the young Elizabeth, educated the precocious Jane Grey, tried to give shape and gentleness to a world built of iron and fear. And yet, when she died, she was left behind. Her husband, Thomas Seymour, fled the castle before her body was even cold. Her daughter, the child she bore in pain and in silence, disappeared from history before her second birthday. The court moved on without her. The world did not pause, and her grave, once carefully sealed beneath the chapel of Sudeley, was broken open over and over again by strangers, by scholars, by drunks with nothing but curiosity and the wrong kind of courage. Her hair was stolen, her fingers unwrapped, her bones sketched and measured, her corpse made into a macabre attraction. She was pulled from her tomb, danced with, pierced with a rusted bar, and shoved back into the earth, upside down, as if she were not a queen, not a mother, not a woman who had once written words about grace and mercy and light. It is a quiet cruelty, that kind of forgetting. It does not look like hatred. It does not spill blood. It simply lets a person fade into objecthood. And that is what Katherine became, an object to be examined. A name on a plaque. A riddle for historians to puzzle over when the mood suited them. For centuries, she was not mourned. She was disturbed. But now we remember. Not in the way history books might want us to remember. Not for her place in a line of queens. Not as a footnote in the reign of Henry VIII. Not as the one who survived while others perished. We remember her because she tried, because she endured, because in a world that devoured women with ambition and burned those with too much voice, Katherine Parr wrote prayers. She read. She taught. She loved again. Even when it was dangerous to do so. And when she died too soon. Alone, but for a newborn, she did not scream. She left behind no bitter letter. No curse. No protest. Only silence. And that silence became her grave, until it was shattered by the shovels of men who never knew her name. But perhaps now, at last, she has what she asked for in those lines. She once penned in her final book of prayers, "O Lord, let me pass from this vale of misery to that joyful place prepared for the faithful, and there to rest in thee." She wrote those words with ink, but they live now in something softer, in the way her tomb finally holds, in the way her story finally reaches the ears of those who can hear it, not as history, but as a whisper from the past. So tonight, before sleep finds you, I think of her not as a queen, not as a wife, not even as a victim, but as a voice that refused to vanish, a woman who lived in the shadows of kings, but still left her own light, a girl who once knelt in a chapel and asked only for peace, and who, after so many long and brutal years, was finally given it. Let that be her story. Let that be enough.
What is that?
No one tells you that a Queen of England was once dug out of the earth. Not once. Not twice. But over